Hi, everybody. It's Jerry Moore, sales engineer here at Phone Suite in the manufacturing plant in Broomfield, Colorado. Sure do thank everybody for coming online on this webinar. So today's webinar, we're starting with a new series basically of hotel phone system installation. And it's a very, very big topic. In fact, it's pretty overwhelming for people that have never done it. And even those that have done it several times, there's a lot of different things to think about, a lot of complexity built into it because of all the tech that's involved with installing a new phone system and all the different players that come with it. And then the biggest job of all, of course, is coordinating all that and getting it done on time. The expectation is always that it will be perfect, and it takes a great deal of planning to actually make that happen. So this series will be broken down into several different parts. It's impossible to cover it all in one webinar without driving everybody crazy. So this was really meant for, and who we designed this presentation for, are people that own hotels, managers, and basically anybody responsible for the end result of your communication systems being up and running. We all know the importance of this is if things don't work, it can be a disaster. You can really chase your tail with a lot of different contractors and have a lot of different finger pointing going on if you don't do this right on the upfront side. The players in this giant production that we're about to embark on, each one of these things could probably be a webinar in as much as itself. So we're going to go through them on a pretty quick basis, but let's talk about them individually real quickly. The trunk provider. So this is your communication to the rest of the world from your phone system. Regardless of where that phone system is or what type of phone system it is, there's going to be trunks involved. And there's all kinds of different trunks. So whether they come from the traditional phone company, whether you're getting them from your cable company, which is also providing you internet and television, or you're getting them from the newer SIP trunk providers. In any event, you need to know about them. You need to have all their contact information. Hopefully you've made friends with somebody inside that organization before you're even starting to coordinate this installation. Just as important, and it may be even more important now, is the internet provider. Trunk provider and internet provider may be the same thing. They may not. So it all really depends on how you decide to do business and how you think about things in your hotel as to who's going to be doing what. But the internet provider obviously is extremely important. They have to be coordinated with the trunk provider if they're not the same company. Those people have to be talking to each other because they need a lot of each other's information. The property management system company, obviously this is totally dependent on brand. Smaller hotels may not even have a property management system, but for the larger ones that do, the integration here is absolutely mandatory. The phone system has to be able to talk to this PMS. PMS has to be able to talk to it. That means particularly on new installs, but on any installation, the coordination between the PMS company and the company providing the PBX is critical. And those, again, the names and contact numbers and email numbers, all that has to be coordinated, and you need to have this done ahead of time so it's not a surprise on installation day who's doing what. Another one is the guest room phone supplier. Sometimes this, again, may be the same people that are supplying the PBX itself. A lot of times, like in our case, we'll supply the PBX, and then the hotelier, the hotel owner, the general manager will go out and shop for his own guest room phones. Either way, that's fine, but we obviously need to make sure that we understand what we're getting. So again, well ahead of time, we want to have those phones ordered. We want to make sure they are labeled correctly. And that means we have to understand a great deal about that PBX before we can actually tell our guest room phone supplier what to put on the faceplate of that phone. We need to understand things like dialing instructions. And there again, that would be somewhat dependent on the PBX supplier, but also maybe dependent on the trunk provider as to how they dial phone calls within their local area. It might be completely different than a different property, and so you just can't assume that you understand the dialing plan until you put it all together. So the guest room phone supplier needs to know all this information to give you a correct faceplate. You also have to meet brand standards. They usually, maybe, or most of these phone suppliers already know the brand standards and have templates for this, but you'll want to make sure it matches everything you need. And of course, you want to make sure those phones are there. Usually those phones need to be deployed and installed by your own staff and plugged into the wall. They'll be tested by your supplier or your installation company, but many times you're going to have to put together those phones yourself and get them deployed to the rooms. If they're already existing, then that takes most of that out. But again, you'll still need to make sure you coordinate with your PBX supplier and the programming people to make sure what it says on the phones you can actually do. So the next great big thing, of course, is the PBX supplier themselves. Just as you know, we've been making hotel phone systems for a long time, since the early 90s. So we're just one of several. The purpose of these webinars is to give you general information, and we certainly hope you'll consider us as your PBX supplier. But it's critical then that that supplier and their installation team, whether it's themselves or a local contractor that you've hired or purchased the system from, is involved in this mix from the get-go. They are the ones that you're going to be relying on to talk about the various features that you need to know, how they're going to integrate, what kind of trunks you're going to have needs to be known by the PBX supplier so they can build the system the correct way, what kind of PMS system. All these things need to work together. So again, this is another one of the players. The installation company, like I say, could be the same company as the supplier, and many times it's going to be a contractor or a reseller of the supplier. So again, coordination is critical. Call accounting, in the case of Phone Suite and some of our systems, call accounting is built into the system. Even so, there are many hotels that want to provide their own call accounting system. They're comfortable with a particular brand or a particular method. That, of course, connects directly to the phone system, so it needs to be known what's going on. Cable contractor, especially on new builds, is critical because this is very likely that the cable contractor is somebody different than the PBX installation company or the supplier, or both. Usually these guys are very specialized, and that's all they do. They terminate or install and terminate the cables and test all the cables, and then they hand off to the PBX. So it's critical we know who they are and exactly what their specs need to be, and that's agreed on before you get started. Now, new with the heavier reliance on the internet and all things IT on the local area network as well is networking administration. So this person can be a lot of different people. It can be a consultant. It can be your own person who does everything IT on your own network and understands what's going on there. That's the best of all worlds, because that person then is reporting to you. They've got your best intentions in mind, and they can help you keep track of all the information that you may not understand or may not be aware of. That all has to work together on that IT network, or it just won't fly. So the networking administrator is somebody you choose. If you don't have somebody like that within your organization, you may want to consider a consultant outside to help you piece pieces together. But understand, it's the most important thing in making all these things work together, is that the network is understood by all that are going to be working on that network. Of course, your own staff, and especially the front desk, need to understand how to work the system, what it's going to take, what cutover day is going to look like, what expectations they can see, and what kind of training do they need. So we'll get into more details about that as we go. But again, they're extremely important players, as these are going to be the first ones to take the first call on your new system. The last thing, obviously, is that system integrator. Now, again, that could be your IT consultant. But the one point I want to make here is do not rely on your vendors to be the system integrator. Their job is to do their piece of it that they know how to do. They may or may not be able to even take on the role of a system integrator and be able to talk to all these other players. So, again, the emphasis is on you as the responsible person to get this coordination done. So, and all that thrown into the mix, then if you're working under a brand, say IHG or Marriott or what have you, there's a whole bunch of brand requirements that you have to fit into as well. And, of course, you'll be tested on those once your phone system is done. So it's imperative that you understand what they are and that you're going to meet those requirements. So, you have a systems integration. This little diagram here is just a general diagram for any kind of systems integration. But the most important thing is you start at the top and you work to the right and prepare, plan, and design. Those are the big ones. Do enough of that. The rest of it will come together. It's funny how many calls we get of people just asking us where to start. After they know the players, it's like, okay, well, what do we do with them? Now, obviously, your vendors can make this much easier for you if they take that responsibility. But ultimately, it's going to be on you. So some of the things you want to make sure you do, and this is all way ahead of the cutover date, is walk through that location. This is really, really important on existing infrastructure. You walk through it, you know what's going on. If there's any particulars in the property that are being handled in a particular way, talk about them. So just for instance, if you have different hours, say, for your spa than you do for the front desk answering, then you want to make plans. You want to think about, okay, how am I going to transfer those calls? Where are they going to end up? What kind of things do I need to know about that spa in terms of their services? What kind of menus do I want to offer? All kinds of details. But the most important thing is that you do this walkthrough and you agree in advance on what needs to happen. If there's changes in the infrastructure, like we're changing phone systems from one type of phone to another, it may require different cabling. You need to identify that and work through that and make those changes and get your plan ready. But this all needs to be done ahead of time. So you won't even be deciding on the installation date and time until you get some of these other things done. At that point, then you're going to set up an installation date and time with everybody involved, and you want to get a sign-off. And perhaps one of the most important documents you're going to work with is a scope of work. That scope of work is both for you and for each one of your vendors. So they know specifically what their charge is, what they're going to be working on, and that you know what the overall scope of work is going to look like so you can put it together. And most importantly, they sign off on it so that you know these things are done. There's no surprises on installation day. Walk through those daily operations as well. So this is the trip through your mind. How am I going to answer that phone? Am I going to answer live at the front desk 24/7? Am I going to give that kind of service? Or am I going to say, you know what, I've only got one person at my front desk. I want them to answer the call personally if they can, but after 2 or 3 rings, I want that to go to an automated attendant or automated answering system of some kind. Those kind of things. Walk through those, storyboard them, whiteboard them, do whatever you can, but make sure that the people that are going to be programming your system understand what it is you're going to want and what you expect. Nothing is worse than expectations that were not voiced. Again, we've seen a number of times and a lot of stories where people just assume that, oh, yeah, it could do this particular feature and this particular function because the old system did that. Well, it was the old system, not the new system. So, again, if you make that assumption, we all know what the result of that usually is. So, best to walk through it, ask all those questions, and with both new builds and old builds, but even for retrofitting an old build, preparing your staff is as important as anything. Nobody likes change, so they need to know as much as they can ahead of time. The beautiful thing is with a lot of new phone systems, you can do this virtually. You can do it way ahead of time without the system needing to be installed. It's an easier training event than it used to be. So take advantage of that. Don't wait until cutover day to tell people that you're doing something completely different than you expected, completely different result. That's just a recipe for disaster. We have seen that happen. This other thing I want to zoom right in on is keep those written records. This is up to you to do it. Now, your vendors obviously are going to have a piece of this. So when we go in and install a phone system, we have records of what's on that system, what extension is what, what rings at what time, those kind of things. But the end of the day for all of you as the person that's responsible for it is you have to keep your own records and they have to make sense to you. So keep that in mind all the way through the process. Do not depend on your vendors to keep those records for you, because obviously they're going to be skewed to whatever the vendor wants you to think instead of what you really need to know. Okay, so you move on, and this is maybe the most important slide. Know what you don't know. Well, how do you do that? If you don't know, how do you know what you don't know? Well, find out. It's become a thing where the phone systems and all communication systems have become involved in that network, and you need to understand what that network requires. If you don't know or don't want to know, you need to find somebody that can help you do that. And you may have to pay them for that, so do not be afraid of it. More and more teams are getting in place from the brands, for instance, that can help you with these kind of things. But at the end of the day, again, it's up to you to know what you don't know. Don't be afraid to answer those questions. Get those questions in writing. Get those answers in writing. And make sure that you are on the same page. But take the time to understand what that network looks like and how critical it is. It's still funny. Some people will come to us and say, oh, no, you're the phone company. You know all this stuff. Well, maybe we do, maybe we don't. But we don't know your particular situation. And it's on you as the responsible owner, as the responsible manager, to know this stuff inside and out. So find out what you don't know. Pre-deploy, it means exactly what it says. Pretty much all the things we talk about. Agree on the call flow. We're going to practice auto attendance. But take the time to do these things. A lot of people overlook this. And it's easy to do, especially when you're in the crush of your day-to-day activities, or even worse, when you're opening a new property. There's so many things to think about. So you want to be talking about this. You want to be scheduling these things to happen. And again, write them down. Write down the results. Write down the times and attendees for all the training classes that you do. Things like provide all users a new extension list. It's absolutely amazing. People have never even thought about doing that, and then they cut over the system and people don't know who to call. Again, because many of these systems can be installed working side by side with your existing system, or it can be installed ahead of time before you even open a hotel if it's a new build, there's no reason not to practice all this stuff. So you can practice all your call flows from, okay, what does it look like when I call in from the outside world? Who do I get? What do I hear? Do all my choices work? Do they go where they're supposed to go? If I leave a voicemail box, what happens to that? What happens to that voicemail? Does it just sit there? How does it notify people? Does it get forwarded to email? So many choices are out there. The bottom line is you and your staff need to know what they are and what's expected. Test everything. And test it, again, before cutover as much as humanly possible. The more you do of that, the better all this will turn out. Make sure your staff is aware of all the changes going over and what's expected of them. So from there, I mean, we have much more we can talk about, but we'll talk about now, how do I go about assessing my needs? I've already kind of stressed the plan, and then plan some more, and I'll keep doing it. But let's start with, at the beginning, where do I start? So size matters. This is how you define your property. You need to understand the basic parameters so that you can go to the manufacturers and go to all the system integrators and people that are involved and tell them this basic information. So with this kind of information, I can get a pretty good idea of what you're going to need in terms of equipment. Obviously, still a lot of other questions to answer, but at least the size and therefore at least a portion of the pricing becomes available once we know this basic information. So the number of guest room phones, sounds like a really easy thing to think about, but there's choices here, of course, too. So if you have a 120-room hotel, obviously you need 120 guest room phones. Well, maybe that's not so obvious. You might want to have 120 extensions, an extension for each room, but you might have multiple guest room phones. You might have a cordless in there, might have one on the bed stand, you have one on the desk. So things you have to think about, and then you need to get those orders, of course, get those ordered. Admin phones pretty much fall into two basic categories: unimportant phones and very important phones. So phones that don't get used very much, like let's say the pool or the laundry room, where they don't need a lot of functionality. They need to be able to place a call. They need to be able to answer a call. Maybe even have a voicemail box associated with them. That's about it. The other admin phones, though, and particularly the front desk and manager positions, you again now have a myriad of choices on what those phones need to be able to do. So you need to talk about those with your PBX manufacturer, with your team, and find out, what do I need? How many lines do I need on a particular phone? What kind of features do I need? Will I be able to see the caller ID? All those kind of things you need to talk about before you purchase those phones, but then make a list of how many of what type you need. Yeah, I already talked about the other phone locations. So, business centers, conference room phones that are specialized, just other areas that might be different than the standard run-of-the-mill single-line telephone. Think about those places. That gives you, and it gives us, an idea of what you're going to expect when we come in to provide you a quote for a phone system. We can talk about trunking. This is a whole different webinar, but we'll start with it just real briefly. How many trunks do you need? It varies, depending on who you talk to, obviously. Old school versus new reality. The fact of the matter is we're all carrying around smartphones, and we're not using those guest room phones to make our outbound calls. So it's really getting down to the fact is how many trunks do you need depends on your hotel staff, your hotel business, and of course the size of the hotel. But it used to really be a 120-room hotel. De facto standard was 12 lines and 10% trunking. It's just very unlikely you actually need that these days. Those calls are now going out over your Wi-Fi or over the cell network itself. So it's become a much less critical thing, but it's still very important, especially if you're doing things within your hotel beyond just the normal hotel business, things like reservation centers or contact centers or business centers within your hotel where they're going to be depending on those phone locations quite a bit. So you want to then talk to your various trunk providers. We'll get into those in a minute. Are there other trunks that are out there that are required to be dedicated? Most of these things are going away, and they're all starting to go to the data network, but you need to be aware if I have to have analog trunks dedicated to a fax, for instance, or an elevator, maybe even an ATM machine, look into that. That's part of your planning. You need to talk to your trunk providers about that and your equipment providers as well to make sure everybody understands what's doing what. And what happened to the phone company? Well, it's just there is no phone company anymore. It's a big tangle now of different providers all offering competitive services. So don't think that's going to be the simple answer. There's all kinds of choices. Local telephone companies still exist. In our case here in Colorado, we're dealing with CenturyLink, which used to be Quest, which used to be US West, was Mountain Bell. So it's all a very confusing mess as to who you can use for your local telephone company. There generally is one plus a bunch of competitors. So, and generally you can move between these competitors at will, but you need to be very careful that you document how you do this. So you can get your phone lines from the local telephone company. They will provide plain old telephone service or digital trunks. Or you can get it, a very popular choice is getting it from your cable company. So let's say Comcast is in your neighborhood. The Comcast rep comes to you and says, hey, we can provide the triple play TV, internet, and telephone service, so you can actually order phone lines and phone service from them as well. And then the new provider is SIP trunking providers, which now they bring those trunk connections to you over your internet connection, which adds to the complexity a bit, and it certainly adds to the choices, as there's tons and tons of providers out there that will do this for you. It's a matter of making those choices, finding out what's right for your business, finding out what you're comfortable with. To make matters worse, all three of these supports or providers could provide SIP trunks, or all three of these services. So it's a lot of shopping around you got to do and take care of before you start talking about cutover, because there's so many choices to make, and they do involve your costs on not only an installation basis, but obviously ongoing basis. So that's probably about all we're going to talk about today. We're going to get into the next session, and it'll be the cutover and training, and it's just as important. But today, the most important thing for you to realize is the planning that it's going to take is something that you want to be well aware of, and you need to be coordinating with these players. This is not a simple, I'm going to work on this for a couple hours and be done. This is something that you need to take into account a much larger picture than you may be familiar with. Next question is, can I get a vendor who does everything, including project management? The answer is yes. It all depends about really what you're willing to pay. There's a lot of good vendors and or consultants out there that will do this. As a manufacturer, we're not really one of them. We're part of this process, and we work as a team with all the other vendors involved. But there are any number of consultants out there that will do this thing for you so that you don't have to learn all this complexity, and they're working directly for you and responsible to you. So if all this is overwhelming and you just don't have the time to get this done, I highly recommend that you put together a consultant or an independent team that is beholden only to you and not to any other vendor. Yeah, as far as cost on consulting or anything like that, it varies. It's just one of those things you'll have to negotiate. The good news is a lot of your brands now have IT teams built into them. They're going to help you with these kind of things. They'll help you make decisions on your internet, your bandwidth. They'll talk to you about the various prices. One piece of advice is for any long-term either trunking or internet providers, try and keep your options open. It doesn't make a lot of sense because the world's changing so rapidly to sign into long contracts. And used to be a long contract was 5 to 10 years. Yeah, these days it's more like 1 year is standard, maybe up to 3, and on the outside 5 years. So make your choices carefully there. But again, shop around, look hard at the various choices, but understand the most critical thing I want to get across today is understand all the players involved and how much you have to know as the responsible person or how much your consultant has to know. And make sure you plan for this and get everybody's sign-off before you start the deployment so everything will be successful and cut over smoothly.